We're recording in progress. This is our fourth recovery workshop that we're running on behalf of the Cities and Local Growth Team at MHCLG or LL. I'm not sure what they're called now. But anyway, we're running it on their behalf. And today we are talking about working from home, and we're really looking at this from the local authority perspective. I mean, all of these recovery workshops are really focused on trying to help local authorities deal with the incredible economic uncertainty that's all over the place right now, but really looking at it from a local perspective and a place-based approach. So I just wanted to start by saying a little bit about the What Works Growth Center. We're one of the government's What Works Centers. We're a partnership between the London School of Economics and the Center for Cities. Our director, Henry Overman, will be speaking later. But we're set up about 8 years ago to help places use evidence to make local economic policy in a way that would help them to achieve more success in the area of local growth. We have lots of resources on our websites that we've put together over the years across all the different local economic policy areas that places would deal with. And we've tried to draw from evidence, really rigorous evidence involving control groups from all of the OECD countries, really. And we also have a variety of, we have big systematic reviews, but we also have like more focused toolkits. So if you're looking at a particular policy angle and how do I make this particular policy work for a certain kind of person, for example, you can find that kind of information on our website. And I'll say it many times, but also feel free to get in touch with us, because I think sometimes we work best when we just work directly with people. So I wanted to point out that we are very focused on two things that I think make us a little bit different. One is the local aspect. So there's a lot of work out there and a lot of talk about the national economy and macroeconomics and that kind of stuff. But I think a lot of the things that people talk about and a lot of the policy that's made by government plays out very differently at the local level. And so that our focus is always very much on local economics, and that can sometimes bring out very different issues than thinking about the effect of policies on the national level, particularly around things like productivity. I think leveling up is one that plays out very differently for local places than it does necessarily for how the government thinks about it. And the second thing is that we really are very focused on economics, and particularly we measure economic growth in terms of wages and employment and productivity. A lot of economic growth work will look at things like property prices as a desirable objective, improving property prices, or like business churn and that kind of stuff, business success rates. We focus on wages and employment because we think that those are the things that benefit local people the most. So that if jobs and income are going up, that's benefiting the people who live in a place rather than other metrics which may be accruing to other individuals. That's the way we like to think about it. Today, we're very keen to hear from all of our participants. We're really interested to hear what you're seeing on the grounds in your place in terms of people going back to work, in terms of what the community is looking like, what the retail is looking like. So do ask questions, please. I think I'll ask people, we have a smaller group than usual, but I think I'd still ask people to put questions into the chat. If you put them into the chat box and with your name and your place, that would be great. And then when Paul and Henry are done speaking, I will probably call on you and ask you to ask your question. And we also, in this particular event, welcome comments, because as I said, we do want to hear from places about what they're seeing on the grounds. We'll run until, so Paul will talk, I think, for about 20 minutes. Henry will probably talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. So we want to have most of the session over to questions and discussion. And we'll run until about 3:15, unless there are people still waiting to get in which case we'll run a little bit longer, but we'll definitely be done by 3:30. So we're very pleased today to have Paul Mizen from the University of Nottingham, who's been doing a lot of work over the period of the pandemic, looking at working from home trends, what people say they're planning to do, what employers are planning to do. And I'll hand over to you now, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Meg, and thank you, Henry, for inviting me. And so I'm going to share a presentation, just talk through that for 20 minutes. Okay, so the work that I'm talking about is going to focus on a case study of the retail and hospitality industry. The reason is that this is a sector of the UK economy that has been impacted by working from home indirectly. Obviously, we've all, to some degree or other, been impacted by COVID. Many of us are working from home, but the retail and hospitality industry relies on people working at work. And when people don't work at work, then a lot of their business just evaporates. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. You might be slightly intrigued by the name of the presentation, Zoom shock. That kind of just was a word that we used to describe how everybody was hit by COVID, and it affected them in lots of ways, including learning how to use Zoom. So this work that I'm doing, if I can just get it to move on, is with a number of co-authors at Nottingham, Birmingham and Sheffield universities. And it is going to ask the question, what happens when people start working from home and they're not spending money in the local area around their workplace? So there are some people who aren't able to work from home. Many of those are furloughed. And they're not able to, but many of them are not working at all because they're simply unable to do their work. The business that they had has evaporated. And one of those sectors that's very much like that is the retail and hospitality sector, which employs about 5.5 million people in England and Wales, about 20% of the workforce. And since we've had persistent working from home, all those coffees that we used to go out for, lunches, after work shopping, entertainment, has just evaporated. The people aren't going out for those things anymore, whilst they're not working in the office. So, so what impact does this have on local areas? That's what we're going to look at. So there is some work that some of my co-authors have worked on that shows the geographic shift of economic activity that took place immediately after the pandemic. But we're extending this work to cover expenditure in the hospitality and retail sector using a new working from home survey, which we've been doing since December of last year. And what this survey does is ask a load of questions about who's working from home, who's going into work, how much they spend at work, and lots of questions like that. And we'll make use of those. And it's particularly focused on a comparison between the present time and the pre-COVID period and people's expectations about what they think they'll do after COVID's finished. So the key points I'd like to get across today are that the shift in expenditure is large. Post-pandemic working from home is likely to settle at around about 22 percentage points, which is higher than the 2019 levels. They were about 13 percentage points. And retail and hospitality demand is going to become much more geographically dispersed as a result. Instead of people going into work as often as they were, particularly into London, they're not going to be spending their time there, so they're not going to be spending money there. And this is going to disproportionately affect a number of retail and hospitality workers. About 90,000 jobs, we think, will either need to move or be lost if people continue to work from home in these numbers. So we'll look at the effects. And one of the things I think makes it particularly relevant for local authorities is that we know that the impact of COVID, what the impact of COVID was, because we can observe it in the data. Whether those jobs actually move to other places depends to a large extent on how local authorities anticipate and make provision for the shifting work patterns and business spending. So that's something that we could perhaps talk about later. So what about quantifying all these effects? Well, essentially there's two parts. There's the inflow of spending that moves into the local area where people live. So what we have here is a calculation which shows the change in the proportion of people working from home, multiplied by the amount that they spend when they're working, multiplied by the number of people that are in a particular employment category. So you multiply all those things together, add them up across all the categories, and that tells you how much spending inflow is going to happen in the neighborhoods where we live. At the same time, there's a spending outflow, which is the amount of spending that isn't taking place around the work area. So same calculation, change in working from home times the amount of spending, but times the number of people who are actually working in a particular zone. So these two things compared to each other tell us the spending change. And of course, it's a geographic change. It's a movement from the place where your work is and the place where you live. And they typically are not the same place. So what kind of questions, we're going to use the working from home survey. Here's some summary information. I can go past this quite quickly, but essentially it's a survey that has been running for 6 months or more. It's basically UK working adults, and we get about 2,500 responses a month, and we ask all sorts of questions about working from home, including spending. And all the data are reweighted using the quarterly labour force survey to make them representative of the UK. So the kind of questions that we ask are, after COVID, how often is your employer planning for you to work at home? So we can get some sense of how much people are going to be working from home after COVID is over. And also, how much do you spend around your business premises? And this falls into 3 categories: food and drinks, lunches, coffees, that sort of thing; shopping near your work, which you might do at lunchtime or after work; and then spending that you make in bars, restaurants, other entertainment after work. So here's a chart which shows that compared to 2019, which is shown on the horizontal axis, the amount of work that's going to be done from home is going to increase. So that red line shows the 45-degree line. And if it was the same as 2019, all the dots would be on the 45-degree line. But in actual fact, they're all above the 45-degree line, some more than others. And you can see the kinds of sectors and occupations that are more likely to be working from home, but they're all higher than they were in 2019. So there's going to be more working from home. And then this table here shows us ranking different occupations by the amount of working from home that they did in 2019, with the lowest at the top and the highest at the bottom. We then look at the change in the working from home in the second column and the spending that they do per week in the final column. So you can see there's quite a variation across different occupations, but there's also a change, quite a lot of variation in the change in working from home. In some cases, computer and mathematical, the change is 40%. In others, like protective services, it's just 7%. So quite a variation. There's also quite a variation by the location. So it depends on whether you're in a town or a large city or in central London as to how much spending takes place. Obviously, central London, there's much more spending going on, partly because it's the prices are higher, but possibly because of the kind of industries that are located there and the occupations that are located there. So how much does retail and hospitality spending actually change? Here's a chart which is a map, it's a map of London, and those of you who are from London will probably be able to recognize the different local authority areas, but this here is obviously central London and the City of London, and this is Canary Wharf. Here, these 2 dark red blobs, and you can see that they've experienced between a fall of 30 to 40% in spending as a result of the COVID shock. So there's been a huge reduction, and if you look at the table, that means that something like over 8,000 jobs have been retail and hospitality jobs have been reduced. There's fewer jobs required, fewer people required to do the jobs because the spending isn't there. So, it's quite a substantial amount, and you can see similar numbers for Westminster, Tower Hamlets, places where the spending has also fallen, number of jobs required has fallen, and then some increases in the spending in areas outside of the centre, but not so many jobs being created. Okay, so just to illustrate what I'm talking about here, we counted up the number of pret-a-mangers that there are in the City of London, and it was 63 that we could count before the pandemic, and 42 of those were closed in January 21. Okay, so 67%, simply because there wasn't the footfall, people weren't demanding lunches or coffees. Now, this is not just a London phenomenon, although London is, as I'll show later on, one of the biggest impacts. You see exactly the same thing in Manchester, but the scale is not as big. Okay, so the change in spending is still large, but not as large as in London, and the number of jobs reduced is much lower. So essentially, there's an impact similar in its character, reduction of jobs in the city centre, more jobs and hospitality activity going on around the periphery, but much smaller in scale. So when we look across the country, what we can see is a similar kind of pattern. So all the big cities show a reduction in spending. It amounts to millions of pounds in Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds, and many millions of pounds in Greater London, and reductions in jobs in the thousands. We think that post-pandemic, it could be that 67 million pounds per week is being reallocated from centres to other places, affecting about 90,000 retail and hospitality workers. Now, the reasons why it's so important in London is obviously there's a very high concentration of jobs there relative to residents. So most of the spend is being done by people who are coming into work as opposed to people who live there. It's also true that a large proportion of those jobs can be done from home and are being done from home, hence the reduction in the spend. And there's also a very high reliance of retail and hospitality businesses on that particular type of spending. So there isn't, for example, much tourism spending going on in the City of London. There is a little bit more in Westminster and maybe some other areas of London, but it's very highly reliant on commuter spending. So here's a final chart just to show how this could relate to incomes and inequality. So what we have here are two charts. On the horizontal axis, we've got an index which shows the extent of deprivation. So the larger the number, the more deprived the area. And the first chart on the left-hand side shows the change in retail and hospitality spending according to the degree of deprivation. So in low deprivation areas, there's a big increase in hospitality spending, and in the more deprived areas, there's a smaller increase. There is an increase, but it's smaller. On the right-hand side, we've got an indication of the extent of working from home, and you can see that the more deprived the area, the less likely working from home will happen. So the kinds of jobs, the kinds of occupations that are amenable to working from home tend to be in the more affluent areas. And so the affluent areas are tending to benefit from the shift in spending. There's more spending and there's more people working from home. So they're seeing an increase in spending, and the less affluent areas are experiencing the opposite. So back to the key points. It's a pretty large shift, 67 million a week, and 3.5 billion in total, just for the retail and hospitality sector. It's going to affect 90,000 jobs, which will either need to move or be lost if this situation persists. And that's the critical question. How much working from home is going to persist? How much is it going to go back to some kind of flexible working, hybrid working, or just revert back to where we were pre-pandemic? The other critical question is, how many jobs are actually created elsewhere depends to a large extent on how these trends are anticipated and how local authorities make provision for shifting work patterns. So for example, if a company that was previously bringing all its workers into central London decides to relocate to a number of hubs outside London and has its workers come into those hubs occasionally, but not every day, will there be provision for those people to do the kind of retail and hospitality spending in those hubs that was previously going on in central London. Will they be able to get their coffees and their lunches, or go for entertainment after work, or even do a bit of retail shopping during lunchtime or after work? So that, to a large extent, that depends on what happens in those hubs, those clusters, what kind of other activities are allowed to take place. And so local authority zoning rules and responses to that shift in location of business and commuting will determine what happens to the retail and hospitality industry. I've got more charts of different areas which we can go to later on, but I think probably that's a good place to stop.
Thanks, Paul. I was wondering if I could just ask you a question before I hand over to Henry, which is this question about how much the change in work patterns will persist. Do you have any sense of this? I think it's been fascinating going through this, how, at the very beginning, lots of people said, I'll never go back to the office. And suddenly everyone is rushing back to the office.
Yeah. So the peak working from home period was May of 2020, when there was over 40% of people working from home at that point. Obviously, most people were working from home all the time and not going to the office at all. What's happened since then is there's been a slight erosion, but not much. So compare that with furloughing. Furloughing was about 30%. Back in May 2020, and it's now declined almost to zero. Well, not quite zero, it's single digits, but it's soon to end because the furlough scheme will end. But during that period, there's been nothing like as large a decline in working from home as there has been a decline in the uptake of furloughs. So it may be that people are not spending all their time working from home. They may occasionally be going into the office, but I don't think people are flooding back to the office. So we do in our survey ask a lot of questions about what people would like to do. Employees say that they would like to spend 2 or 3 days working from home ideally, and have 2 or 3 days in the office. Employers say that they would like employees to be working from home 1 day a week and in the office 4. So there's a bit of disagreement there, and probably that's going to settle down on hybrid working, where people agree that certain teams will be in on certain days, or maybe all the office will be in on certain days and not on others. That's going to depend on the type of work and the industry that they're in and what the industry norms turn out to be. But there is this kind of, I mean, it's true, there was a peak in May of 2020 and it's kind of declined, but not as much as you might think.
Interesting. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we will come back to you. Henry, do you want to turn on your camera and give us your thoughts about this?
Yeah, so thanks. Actually, I mean, that's really fascinating, Paul. And I use a lot of your stuff, so it's great to hear you talk through some of it. Let me actually start with the last point, actually, which you just picked up at the end in response to the question with Meg. The way I have presented this, in fact, using your underlying survey results, is precisely to pick up on that tension. Lots of people would like more home working, when you ask them. And it feels like when you see what the firms are going to do, lots of people may be disappointed. And I think the interesting thing here is clearly, because, and I think again, this is possibly work you've done, because the firms are really worrying about the productivity effects of having so many people out of the office. And the reason why I just wanted to pick up on that here is that there's going to be a really interesting tension here for what policy does, because I guess it's going to have to ask itself, is what we want to do to get back to the status quo, or is what we want to do policy interventions that are actually going to narrow that gap between what firms want and what workers want? And you can see, it raises some pretty fascinating choices, because the sort of set of things you do to facilitate that is going to be around enabling infrastructure, e.g. ICT, but also things like, what are we going to do about childcare? Well, what are the childcare settings that people are going to be in? There's a whole sort of set of things that we would need to be doing around cultures to try and see if we can meet that gap. There's a whole sort of set of policy questions around skills, organisation and management. And then there's also these questions which we're starting to see come up in the press. Actually, I noticed yesterday or today, was it, talking about, what are workers' rights going to be here in terms of, right to remote work, right to disconnect. What's the regulatory regime going to look like for Home Office? So I think that, that question, it's fascinating sort of speculating about what we think are going to do, but actually there's even an immediate policy question of, are we going to facilitate this? Working from home shift, that this is something we want to spend policy resources on, or is it something that we actually want to counter and go against? So I think that's the first sort of thing that I'd sort of interested to come back into. And, and I also think that some of those things are clearly central government policy questions, right? Like what we do about workers' rights, but there are also questions about co-working spaces, and actually you hinted at it with your, what are we going to allow in retail and hospitality? But there's also, what are we going to allow in the housing stock, on home working, on shared working spaces, etc. So I think it will be, it's interesting to pick up on that, and I would like to hear sort of people's views on it. I think my second reflection here, which sort of it picks up on a point you made, but also picks up on those points I've just made about home working, is I think there are major distributional consequences to what we're just about to see. So on the working from home stuff that I've picked up, for example, I mean, we know, women are more likely to work in professions with low capacity to work. We know they pick up disproportionate amounts of the childcare. So some sort of fundamental shift like this could have really big implications. And I was really struck with the fact that, your job predictions, what's really worrying is the fact that this is a shift in spend from relatively deprived to more affluent areas. They're clearly not necessarily near one another, and most of the jobs we're talking about tend to be at the lower end of the income distribution. So I think that it's really important to flag those. I think the other thing which you didn't pick up on, but actually I'd be really interested to get your take on, is in some ways, I know it. So I'm going to caveat this by saying I think 90,000 low-income jobs going is a major shot, and it's not something we should be blasé about, and we're really going to have to think about how to help people adjust here. But actually, presumably, if that's going to persist, the shifts in the office employment that are underpinning that are going to be substantially larger. So I just wondered if there's anything in what you've done that tells us, well, look, if we're going to get 90,000 jobs shifting in retail and hospitality, how many jobs are you predicting? What does that look like, and how many jobs would underpin that? I don't sort of have a feeling for that, but it feels like it's got to be many multiples, right? Because, if you think about those Pretz you mentioned, they are serving, 1,000 office workers lunch, each one of those that go. So I'd really be interested in your reflections about, all right, if you're telling me it's 90,000 lower paid retail and hospitality jobs that have shifted around, just really what magnitudes are we talking about in terms of office workers? Because clearly, if you're a local authority thinking about this and what you're going to do in terms of commercial, yes, you've got a decision on retail and hospitality, but you've potentially got a much bigger decision on what you're going to do about office space. I suppose the other thing I would pick up is that finally, that I'd also be interested in hearing your or other people's speculation on, is that obviously what you're doing at the moment is really doing it holding residential patterns at a sort of broadish spatial scale constant. And I actually think that's kind of right. I mean, my central prediction is still that mostly what we're talking about in terms of the shifts here are going to be from centre city to suburbs, rather than large shifts across places in terms of the composition. I'm confident that that prediction is right in terms of overall population numbers, because we just haven't got enough vacant housing to see large population shift. I'm just slightly less confident, in terms of the distributional stuff. I mean, it could make, skilled workers who've traditionally been very concentrated in London, relatively concentrated in terms of their employment in some of our other major cities, it could make them think about it. So I guess I'm just interested in yours and others' reflections on, how you think about those shifts. So I think that's probably enough from me. So it's really fascinating to see. I think reflections on what we should be doing in terms of facilitating or not, reflections on how big those shifts in retail and hospitality are relative to the underpinning shifts in office employment, and then anything you've got on, do you think the composition really, that we might see sort of residential behaviours changing and people really sort of moving out of cities and commuting long distances? But not just you. I think those are questions that I'd be interested in everyone's take on.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sorry, Paul, just before you start, I just want to say that, we'd really like to hear from places about this, because I feel like a lot of the stuff that we are getting in general in the press and that kind of stuff is very London centric. So it would be interesting to, London is so unique in terms of the way people commute and things like that. So hearing from other places would be great. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Great. So, well, thanks very much, Henry. That's really, there's so many points here, and I think I'm going to only be able to answer them they're all overlapping. So I'm going to try and answer them, but I may not be answering them in the same order that you've actually asked the questions. I mean, the first one though, this question of what's the policy focus, and should we be encouraging this working from home to stick, or should we be discouraging it? Obviously, that to some extent there is a government question about whether we should be encouraging people back to work. Should we be handing that over to the businesses to decide, or deciding, on behalf of others, that we're going to try and make it happen? Whatever happens, it's going to have some implications for the retail and hospitality sector. But I think more broadly for the economy, it is going to make us think about what types of infrastructure we want to put in place. I mean, do we really want more and faster commuting into the cities, or do we want to establish, the ability to work either from your home or somewhere else that doesn't require you to commute so far? What does it mean for infrastructure around broadband connections and speed of broadband connections, that sort of thing? Pretty important too. So all of these things are kind of big decisions for the National Infrastructure Commission, to decide what are the priorities. But into this mix also, there's the net zero question, which is, if we want to try and stop producing so much carbon in the economy, then maybe we do want to encourage people to work from home a bit more and commute a bit less. And that may be one goal that we achieve, along with overcoming the congestion problems and the shortage of housing problems and all those other things that you've mentioned as well. So it can actually address quite a few other objectives, as well as making people perhaps a little bit more satisfied with their work, depending on whether they choose to work from home or actually are compelled to. So actually a funny thing about this survey is that a lot of our observations, at least at the early part, were when people were really required to work from home and they had no choice in the matter, and they did it for all the time. What will be more interesting will be to see people's reflections when they have the choice about whether to go back to work and can make the decision about how much they go back to work. So all our evidence so far suggests that people would prefer, when the constraints are off, to be working from home about 2 or 3 days a week, but they don't want to be absent from the office permanently. So so that's something that I guess businesses will have to take into account. Another issue which comes into this and also affects the distributional issues that you raised is who benefits most from working from home. And it's clear that people with higher incomes and more educated, higher skills definitely benefit compared to those with lower skills and lower incomes. There's absolutely no doubt about that, in the sense that they have more. They're more likely to be able to persuade their employer that they can work from home as much as they want, rather than have it imposed on them. And of course, many jobs that are lower income, lower skill, requiring lower educational attainment to do them, actually often aren't that amenable for working from home anyway. So there is a distributional consequence, and it seems that most of the benefits from working from home and perhaps a better lifestyle, come to people who are at the upper end of the kind of educational and skills distribution. And these aren't the retail and hospitality people, are they? They're the people who are working in the offices in well-paid jobs. There obviously are going to be many, many more people who are affected than just the 90,000 low-paid retail and hospitality workers. That's why those jobs are essentially going to be relocated or lost, because the demand is not there at the moment. But those other jobs that we're talking about, the many, probably hundreds of thousands of jobs, if not millions of jobs, that support the retail hospitality industry, those jobs are not exactly lost. They're just relocated. Those are the people who are able to work from home. They may well end up working from a different place if it's not their home, not necessarily returning to the same central London location or central Manchester location. But there are obviously many, and so from a local authority perspective, I guess there is going to be a really interesting question about how much demand for office space is going to move. What we seem to be observing is that the demand for the high grade, top quality office space will remain in the big cities, but the lower quality office space is probably going to disappear. That may end up turning into something else, maybe converted over to residential or something. But that slightly less high end office space might well be moved out to other less expensive areas, and it may be that people will be commuting shorter distances or living nearer to their work, as a result of some of that. So that could well be a trend that local authorities have to be aware of. What else? So yes, the who's going to be affected? Well, I mean, I think it's quite possible that we might see quite an interesting difference in the demographics of our cities as a result of this. This is not my main area, but observationally, it seems that young people are much more willing to go into the office, spend more time in work. Possibly our cities will become younger, and those people who are perhaps a little older, perhaps have other commitments, families, or to look after, may well migrate out of the cities. And if they're only going into the office a couple of days a week, then maybe that will facilitate them traveling further less often. So we may see that people are prepared to do longer commutes less frequently, rather than commute in every day. So that's something to watch. I understand that this is not just a UK phenomenon, that in the US this is already happening around some of the big cities in the eastern states. So people moving further away, separating from their workplace and coming in occasionally. And also, I mean, in the IT tech sector, that's also happening apparently. So yeah, these are all interesting trends that we need to monitor. But to a certain extent, whether they happen will perhaps depend on whether it's made possible for these for new office developments to emerge in other locations, or for supporting infrastructure to be provided around those workplaces. So that's kind of a question which then comes down to the more local level rather than national level.
Thanks, Paul. I have a couple questions. I was wondering if Debbie Skeller, and if I think we've met before, Debbie, but I can't remember where you're from. So if you could tell us, and if you wanted to talk through some of the stuff you put in the chat, and again about a lot of it about net zero.
Have I managed to come off mute?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with Zoom. I'm more of a Teams girl now. Sorry, I have done a bit of a brain dump, haven't I, in the comments? I was just thinking as you were speaking through, that I think it's kind of that nature of work will very much impact on whether people return at all or in a blended way between office type roles. So the example, I'm from the Swindon and Wiltshire Local Enterprise Partnership, so I'm not a business, I'm not a local authority, but in that economic development sphere. So just from our own personal experience, I haven't been in the office since the middle of March 2020, and our organisation has actually doubled in size. I've had colleagues that have been recruited and moved on in that period of time and not actually physically met them. And I could imagine that I'm not unusual in that sense either. And we've been reflecting on the fact of how much we've saved in terms of our carbon emissions with commuting. Clearly, Wiltshire is a rural area, so you can't really get from A to B unless you've got a car. So we've liked the positive impact we've had in terms of net zero and our reduction of our impact in terms of working. And although we've maintained our offices, there is that big question mark about what you can save in terms of rent, which I think will be a sort of a driver as well, which will continue. So, there's very much a question mark over us. And I think having worked with colleagues in local planning authorities, particularly say in Wiltshire, their driver is to bring it back to neighbourhoods, to reduce commuting, to have those services closer to home, and which might end up in some of that kind of neighbourhood renewal of town centres, market towns. And that puts sort of older office and industrial space, as you were just saying, Paul, actually more at risk of being redeveloped into residential. And I think that's something that we've kind of heard on the grapevine. There are some conversations that's more likely. The less attractive ones, that they just won't be competitive. And the final thing I put down was it just made me think about in some of the services that I've engaged with, whether that's renewing car insurance or various other services, speaking to the bank, they're all working from home. It's not quite that clean quality air sound that you get trying to arrange whatever it is. You can tell someone's clunking away in the kitchen or the bedroom, but actually you still get the services you need. And I do wonder whether some of the big call centres may structurally change in the way they operate. And there are your young people who travel into cities, and it was just an interesting thought going, actually I wonder what the future for those 1,000-seat call centres or 500-seat call centres are going to be, because that will have an impact in those geographies. So I say it was just, you sparked a lot of thoughts that I just dumped into the chat.
And on that last point, if I could just pick up on it, it's true that there could be some relocation, so that you don't necessarily need to have everybody, coming into the call center to be able to do provide the services that they offer, and they could possibly do that from home. But it's also true that there's nothing to say it should stay in the UK either. This maybe facilitates movement of jobs internationally as well as within our nations. So this is to some degree a bit of a risk that actually jobs that are services that could be performed from anywhere might well be performed from somewhere else rather than the UK, and so we need to be aware of that too. There's a list of jobs that can be essentially done remotely, tasks really that can be done remotely, and so we can be pretty sure which jobs have a high proportion of tasks that can be done from anywhere, and those, I guess, are the ones that are probably more at risk of moving than others.
Actually, let me just come in on the carbon emissions point. Clearly a pure working from home model has massive implications for reducing the carbon footprint of the commute. But hybrid models, I'm really not sure how to think that through, because I think so. Two things that I think might offset the direct benefits of working from home is that I still think we could end up with quite a lot of consolidation in the office market. You know, when you're a firm that expects people to be in every day, you need offices close to where people are. When you expect to only have people, you know, coming in twice a week, you don't necessarily. And so I think that there is something about the fact that firm decisions could end up moving office locations, you know, consolidating their office holdings, and that could drive commuting patterns way up for the 2 days a week you do have to go in. And I think there's going to be a similar effect on the residential side. You know, people will just be willing to factor in longer commutes if they have only got to go in 2 days a week rather than 5. And I genuinely have a completely open mind on the extent to which the direct benefit will be offset by those indirects. I'm always struck by the fact that we do know, for example, that reductions in speed never seem to translate. Reductions in speed across the network as a whole do not seem to translate into changes in commute hours. So, you know, the most people commute an hour.
Yeah.
And, you know, everything we do to change speeds or whatever have actually just tended to impact on the distance people commute rather than the time that they are willing to spend on it. So I think there's some really important work that's going to be needed there that says, in a hybrid world with consolidated commercial and different residential choices, what do we know about what the likely carbon impact looks like? I'm hopeful, you know, that the direct impact would outweigh the indirect. But like I said, that example of the fact that speeds always translate into greater distances rather than reduced commuting times, I think is a sort of salutary lesson from history.
Yeah.
I have a weird anecdote. I have a niece who lives in Brooklyn, and she is driving to Washington, D.C., which is like a 5-hour drive, you know, once a week for her job, working from home the rest of the time. But you would never do that. And I'm sure it's unsustainable, but that's a commuting pattern no one ever would have thought of.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask Saloni Radia to speak. I know she had, I think you had a really interesting point about retail jobs and hospitality jobs actually moving to affluent areas, given where the people who do those jobs live. Can you?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Meg. I can't actually see the general chat, I'm afraid, so I can't see what other questions have been asked. But one of the points I wanted to just make was that I'm the Economic Development Officer for Windsor and Maidenhead, very new into post just this month. And it's really interesting what you were saying about the retail and hospitality jobs. We are a tourism centre because we have Windsor in the borough. We have a huge amount of hospitality and tourism vacancies and we cannot fill them. So we have got a lot of young people who are out of jobs. The claimant counts have gone up over 200% for that youth, the young population, which generally take these jobs, but they're not taking the jobs that are on offer. And I really think that there are two things that we need to think about. First of all, if you're in a low paid retail or hospitality job, can you afford to live in an affluent urban area or non-urban area and work in those jobs? Two, really, do we think the demand is going to move that much? Because if you're working from home, you've got ready access to your own fridge. How many times are you going to go out and buy a sandwich from the equivalent of Pret in your local village centre or your local town centre? Maybe once or twice a week to break things up, but I can tell you won't do it every day. So that spend is not equivalent. You know, it's not those people who are getting up at 6 a.m. to jump on the train to go into the city with lots of cash who are going to be spending money out in the suburbs. And two, I don't think that the there are the staff really to support 90,000 jobs moving directly out there. I really think that there's going to be a change in how these things work, and there's going to be a movement of jobs. I'm also seeing that in our local area, we are not getting people back to work in anything like the numbers, working in offices in anything like the numbers that you might even be seeing in London, because we're still in the 40-50% down against the baseline figures before COVID around here in this area. It's between about 40 to 50% in our local authority and neighbouring ones. So I think it's different if you're not in London and you haven't got a big head office that you've invested in that you want everybody back to. And I know that in this borough, even the local authority is encouraging people to stay working from home most of the time. So I think it will differ place to place in terms of what local policy is, but also, I can't see this big change in terms of just those jobs moving out.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I completely agree with it. What we documented is what we can document that is more certain is the reduction in spend as a result of people working from home. What we can't document with so much certainty is, whether that spend will move somewhere else. And as you rightly point out, whilst there may be few other alternatives if you're commuting into London, let's say, to going out and buying your lunch or your coffee, at home there, you've got the alternative of just carry on eating at home and not spending anything. Against that, I guess you could say that maybe people will want some variety, and with hybrid working, it will diminish the impact of the overall effect anyway. They'll be in work some of the time. If they're in work locally, then maybe they'll spend money locally, but not as much as they were reducing their spend from the city centres. I think we're not suggesting actually that the money's just going to translate, just shift to other places. But I think what we're saying is that we know there's been a reduction in spend that may end up some proportion of that may end up to be permanent. But then whether any of it shifts depends on what happens and where people locate and what, amongst other things, local authorities and businesses do to facilitate that move out of very dense urban areas to less dense areas.
Mate, can I chip in as well on this?
Yeah, let me just say one thing before you do, please, which is if you do want to ask a question and you're having trouble with the chat, just turn on your camera and wave your hand around. I'll call on you. Sorry, go ahead, Henry.
Well, I was going to say, so I do think it's interesting. So when I've talked about this before, I have a picture of Boris eating a sandwich to talk about home production. It's always my favourite cliched thing to do when I want to talk about, So I was really worried about the home production and online shifts that we're likely to see. Although what's interesting about Paul's stuff, I come back to the fact that 90,000 sounds horrible, and it's terrible if you're one of those 90,000. But actually, those are sort of assuming that home production and online is going to come out of that 90,000, right? So I suppose the way I'm sort of thinking about it. So Paul is saying, we sort of predict 90,000 jobs are at risk of needing to move. Well, and then you would sort of say, well, of that 90,000, some are going to go to home production and some are going to go to online. But actually, it does at least give you an upper bound for the fact that those behavioural changes, even if they destroyed a third of those jobs, we're talking about 30,000. And that's obviously horrific if you're one of the people affected. But it's actually not a large major macro shock relative to what we've done with Brexit, for example, right? So actually that would make that COVID shock look quite small relative to the Brexit shock, which surprises me actually, because I sort of, before I saw Paul's numbers, I have to say I was a bit more worried that those shifts could be quite big. But if 90,000 is, if I understood, so let me actually just double check, Paul, that seems a reasonable way of sort of back of enveloping it, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, though, that I would pick up on, which I think is really, really important, and we know it's going to be a major problem, and actually this comes back to Debbie's point, we do have some pictures for what travel to work areas look like for high skilled versus what travel to work areas look like for low skilled. And travel to work areas for high skilled are just very large relative to travel to work areas for lower skilled workers. So, you know, if the sort of shifts that Debbie were talking about and the ability to work from home expand those high skilled travel to work areas even further, you know, we just get an increasing mismatch between the low skilled travel to work patterns and the high skilled travel to work patterns. And actually, it's kind of just another point hammering what Paul was saying, which is we know who's going to end up adjusting there, which is that, you know, your low paid cleaner, if they want to come and clean your house, is going to suddenly face a commute that is considerably longer than currently. I mean, I'm just confident that's unfortunately the side of the market which we'll have to adjust, because that's what we've seen with cleaners of offices, and, you know, all of these sort of things suggest that the adjustment comes in the fact that the lower paid end of the market end up having to commute much more with significant implications for them. So I do think, Solani, it's a really important thing. The final thing I'd say on this is that it's very, very difficult to extrapolate from the current problems you're seeing to the structural ones, because I just do think the double interaction of COVID and Brexit means we've just lost a lot of people that would have been available to fill those jobs quickly. And I genuinely don't have a feeling for what the medium to long-term adjustment will look like in those kind of occupations that you're talking about.
Can I just add?
Yeah, please.
Okay, sorry. It's really interesting that I had a discussion with some of the major employers in our area yesterday, and their big issue was recruitment. And it was around all sorts of different skills areas. So it was retail, it was hospitality, it was engineers, it was multi-trades, it was carpenters, it was plumbers, it was seasonal labour, it was permanent jobs. Across the piece, they are struggling to find people. So we know that there are more vacancies than ever before at the moment. You know, that's a general trend across the UK, but it was quite interesting to see that the low skill, difficult hour occupations of hospitality and some retail and those seasonal jobs that are very hard work and not great rates of pay, people are not being attracted back into them. And there is this hold from foreign labour, as you've just said, Henry, but there is also this reluctance of the local populations to move from jobs because they're worried about when they've done surveys and they've talked to people, they're worried about whether if there's another lockdown or another round of COVID, if these businesses will stay viable. So they want to stay put. And two, there is competition for jobs. And we know that certain businesses are paying a starting bonus and adding money to their basic rates of pay and in a different sector, and people won't go back to retail and hospitality because they perceive them as less desirable jobs. So even though we've got a lot of vacancies and we have a lot of claimants, it's not translating into those things joining up locally. I don't know if anybody else is seeing that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lonnie. It's vexing, isn't it? Does anyone else want to come in on that point? We did do a session about, Jesse Matheson. If you can turn on your camera.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think that's a really excellent point. And this is something we're also hearing about certainly happening in the US as well. So there's a lot of these particularly lower skilled jobs that are just not being filled right now. And I think part of this, part of it could very well be Brexit, but part of it, I think, is what we're seeing with a bit of a geographic mismatch right now. So the workers are not where the demand is. So the workers are not living in the affluent areas where the demand is. And what will over time have to happen is wages and compensation in general for these jobs needs to increase until it just makes commuting more of a viable option, or perhaps moving into the areas where the demand is more viable. So I would expect that we'll see an increase in wages over the next year in these jobs, as we're starting to see already by the sounds of things.
Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, let me just come in briefly on that. I think so, you know, upward wage pressure for the low paid, you know, is a good thing here. I mean, and you know, I'm kind of happy if that's the outcome of this, is that we get good upward pressure for lower paid workers, and that helps address some of these vacancy problems. That seems like a plus. I think what worries me, spit back to the comments I've made before, is that I think it's almost impossible to solve the geographic mismatch, because the house price, you know, the capitalization into house prices in these desirable locations is just going to get more extreme, not less. So I can't see any shift in wages that will make these more desirable suburbs affordable for the lower income households. You know, I mean, what's my central prediction here is that, you know, we're more desirable suburbs, more desirable commuting locations with good amenities are going to see you know, upward increases in demand from relatively skilled workers. Those places are already expensive. They're going to get even more expensive. And, you know, lower skilled workers are just not going to be able to afford to live in those places. I have no confidence that we'll see a supply response because, you know, planning in Britain, you know, we don't really see a supply response. So I think all of the adjustments got to come on the wages side. I don't know what, Paul, what your feeling on that is, but that's, I can't see the geographical mismatch. Now, in other countries, by the way, you know, America is just completely different. I mean, my central predictions of what might happen in America, where you've got cities that, you know, have very responsive housing supply, would be completely different to my central predictions for the UK, where housing supply is so inelastic. But I can't see you ever fix a geographical mismatch problem. It just seems to me it's going to get worse, not better.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that would be my intuition too. I think it's all going to come from longer commutes, but compensation for those commutes.
Which is a bit back to Debbie's problem. You know, I mean, there's an example where the commuting patterns go up, not down, as a result of the shifts that we're going to see.
Chloe, you have your hand raised. Do you want to come in?
Hi, hi everyone. I'm Chloe. I'm the Business Engagement Officer in West Berkshire. Obviously quite different to London, and just to reinforce some of the points that's already been made, we're seeing a big difficulties in recruitment too in our hospitality and retail sectors. And I think I just wanted to share a few things that we're seeing really. We've got quite a lot of like co-working space in the area, because we've got quite a few digital tech companies in the area and larger employees. And as much as we thought we'd see them fill to, I guess, 100% capacity or close to 100% capacity as people start coming back to the office, we're actually not finding that. We're finding them around 60-70% capacity. So it just shows that maybe, in smaller areas, companies aren't willing to bring their employees back as soon as currently. But we're also trying to attract more footfall and bring visitors into some of our towns and villages. And that's really to get our area on the world map, because I think a part of the problem with our area is that if you're a young person that's not from the area, then why would you, think of moving or working in West Berkshire without knowing what it has to offer? So those are just a few things we're doing as a council currently.
Thanks, Chloe. That's really interesting.
No.
Yeah, it seems like you're seeing a lot of the same problems. Paul, did you want to say anything about that?
No, except that it's really, I think this is, this is an aspect of the problem that we kind of anticipate in our presentation, which is that, you know, it's harder to generate new jobs in geographically more dispersed areas than it is to create new to compensate for the jobs that are being lost in the really concentrated, densely populated areas like the cities, you know. And I guess this is kind of the benefit of the cities, right? You know, that everyone's there, and that's where the demand is, and everything is, you know, it's densely populated, but it, you know, there are a lot of people there all spending money. When it's more dispersed, it's much more difficult to make provision, and I think it is a genuine problem. I don't know what the solution is exactly, except perhaps to that, you know, maybe there will be hubs around major employers that will, you know, allow local authorities to create places where people can commute to and work, but shorter commutes, and a range of businesses, you know, that allow some, you know, it's not as concentrated as a big city, but there is a degree of concentration that allows these allows spending to take place, and for enough people to be around to make it viable for businesses to set up in those areas. But it is a genuine problem, and I think it's one that you know, we'll have to think about if this becomes a permanent arrangement, and that's still something that we're going to wait and see whether it is, or the extent to which it is.
Do you,
oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, do you reckon that there will be much impact of the fact that the schools are now kind of more reliably open? I kind of, my heart turned cold when you said about childcare being a problem. I know it's becoming a big problem all over the place, you know, typical low-paid job. But will the schools going back reliably?
That makes it, yeah. So we asked a number of questions about, you know, what makes it, you know, we asked people about their preferences for working from home, and then we asked them about their circumstances, you know, how much space they have, how many other people they care for in their family, etc. And, you know, people with kids, it's really much harder to work from home than if you don't have kids. So, and even if they're at school for part of the day, that can help. So, you know, it does affect the decision whether people want to be working from home or not. There are lots of other factors too, the quality of the broadband, you know, lots of other things that influence people's age, actually, you know, that affect people's desire for working from home more.
Yeah, I was just going to make 2 points, one of which is to pick up on Paul's thing that relates to Chloe's. You know, in small places, there can be sort of idiosyncratic, specific things to small places that can have really disproportionate impacts and that are very, very hard to predict. So, you know, the sort of larger, you know, the larger places that we get to, the more sort of confident I am that coming off of the sort of broad structural trends and thinking through the kind of things that Paul has talked about and that I would talk about, I'm reasonably comfortable that they'll give me a sort of reasonable prediction. For smaller places, you know, you really can have a big hit from, you know, just one local employer deciding they're really not going to return to the office. And so, you know, I don't want to downplay that. It's just very, very hard to sort of talk systematically about these things because the decisions of a small number of players can have a very large impact. And then actually there was something that Chloe said that made me think I should come back and revisit one point that I made, which is that I said, we were talking about the you know, whether home production and the shift to online mattered. And I said, actually, I was worrying about that quite a lot. But then Paul's numbers, I said, perhaps that worries me a little bit less. But I realised that Paul's numbers only tell us the upper bound for the impact on the shift in demand between office locations and home locations. The fact that we have seen a percentage shift to online within a year that took us 10 years to achieve on the general trend, actually that is very worrying for the kind of footfall and high streets that Chloe's talking about, because that's nothing about the shift in demand patterns that we've seen. That's off the underlying base. And those numbers could be really quite large for retail, bricks and mortar retail, I guess, as people would say, right? Because I was sort of saying, oh, maybe off the shift, that number doesn't sound too big. But if it's off the base, and we really have seen these very large percentage shifts in the amount of business that's being done in retail. If that doesn't come back, that'll have huge implications for footfall across the country, rather than these relative shifts that Paul has been talking about. That's a slightly depressing thought. I was reassured, and now I'm worried again.
Get reassured again. Debbie, did you want to ask a question, make a comment?
Please. I was just reflecting on the conversation we had about retail and the difficulty of filling vacancies, and the jobs are there but they're not being filled. And I don't have any hard evidence for this. I only have personal experience, which we've kind of been knocking about at work, and I'd be really interested to know whether this is a feel of what might be going on in other places as well. So we live in a small city with a strong visitor economy, and I have a 17-year-old child who is in sixth forms looking for kind of that part-time weekend work, of which there are adverts aplenty. But they all want 1 year experience. And here we are in a pandemic where those two summers worth of young people having kind of hit 16 and got their national insurance number and actually available for work aren't being given the opportunity to have those kind of entry level, basic entry into sort of retail with a little bit of training, even if it's just a couple of days support to go, right, now you know the basics, off you go. And we did wonder whether that might actually be a bit of a factor, that recruiting mindset hasn't changed yet. Everyone's looking for that easy entry or have a year behind you, where there's this backlog of young people who won't make it through the cut. That may be not the case, but that was just something we have been talking about at work and amongst friends, etc.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether Paul wants to come into this, but look, I don't know whether it's preferences of firms and not adjusting. It's just, I think the evidence is that when firms become very financially constrained, the last thing they want to do is spend any money on training people that are only going to be with them just for short periods of time. I think that's generally, unfortunately, a bit of a pattern here. I can't remember what I was looking at the other day, but in-work training programs just fell through the floor during the financial crisis. Spend on in-work training. So, you've got to think that, I mean, things you're talking about, a day's worth of training. I mean, I don't really have a strong view on that, but I think anything that requires more substantial investment in training, just the incentives for firms to do it are reduced when there's marked uncertainty and high turnover. I mean, we know that, and their ability to spend money on it falls rapidly in times when they become massively credit constrained and they are worrying about, paying next week's wages, etc. So I think the problem is like a perfect storm. The demand for training, the need for training is going up because lots of the people that could do this stuff have gone, who had those basic skills. But at the same time, there's just lots of evidence that suggests that, firms retrench on training in points of crisis in the business, and lots of firms are in crisis. So it's obviously, to be honest, what needs to happen is that the government need to, I mean, you see it with lorry drivers, right? I mean, actually at some point government has to intervene or think about how to incentivize these things if we can't get rid of the basic constraints that firms are facing, because those low training levels will persist otherwise. Because although collectively it's good, it would be good for the social care sector to train people to fill their vacancies. But when there are a huge number of vacancies, you just worry that as soon as you train them, they're going to go off and get a better job somewhere else. And so I think that double whammy of large numbers of vacancies, ability for people to move around, plus financially constrained firms, I mean, all the basic economics of training would tell us that that is the point at which in-firm training spending tends to fall a lot, and the only solution then is for someone to step in and try and fix that.
So nothing's going to change, and really, like you say, it's that vicious downward spiral of yeah. Okay,
Well,
thank you.
Let me make a little bit of a silver lining on that cloud, because I think it's absolutely right that during times of uncertainty, the financial crisis was a classic one. You know, money was tight and there was lots of uncertainty, so no investment in training or in any kind of, well, investment turned down a lot. And so it did also around Brexit. The uncertainty around Brexit cut investment of all types, and COVID likewise, because of the, just because we hadn't faced this situation before, businesses having lots on their plate besides thinking about investment, i.e. how are they going to make sure their business could continue when people weren't allowed out, etc. But we do ask a question. It's a different survey, decision maker panel survey. We ask firms, what do they plan to invest in? What types of investment do they plan to do in the post-pandemic period? And the good news is they say quite a lot of extra training in spending on training and research development and software and IT, which sort of supports the idea that maybe they're equipping their workforce to continue to work from home at least some of the time. And they're moving away from investing in more tangible things like shops or offices, and spending more on those other things. So there is a little bit of hope there for the future.
Thank you for that. Does anyone have any other questions or comments they'd like to make? I mean, I think if we have nothing else from our participants, and I want to thank you guys for all the contributions you've made. It really helps to hear what people are seeing on the grounds. I think every one of these events that we've done, this is the fourth, people have talked about the real issue of mismatch between the unemployed people they have and the jobs that are going. And we've had some interesting anecdotes about people negotiating, even with big employers for better deals. And, it's such an unusual time. And I think that it's getting the word from the ground about what people are seeing is especially valuable right now. So thank you for that. Henry, did you want to wrap up with some positive, uplifting, good news for us? It's all going to be okay.
Well, we'll see. It's COVID is another major shock that we need to find our way through, like Brexit and like the net zero transition, right? I don't think it's all doom and, there's lots of challenges. I guess the cliche is there's lots of opportunities that come with that. I think there's lots of scope for policy to help ease the transitions that we're going to see. Actually, I was just going to finish, to be honest, rather than really trying to sum up, because I think, hopefully people have got a feeling for some of the things, by just thanking Paul. And, it should become clear, Paul, that I've been plagiarizing a lot of your stuff in terms of helping my thinking about this. Am I right in saying that the Eco Observatory is a good place to read about stuff that you have been doing in a sort of user-friendly format? I was trying to think where to refer people.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the Economic Observatory is one, and Vox EU is another. We've put out various blogs in those places, what the implications are for shifting spending and lots of other aspects of working from home. So yeah, if people want a accessible read, that would be a good place to go.
They're actually both of those. Eco Observatory, I think, is easier slightly than Vox, but both of those are actually fantastic resources for getting a handle on this. And like I said, I go there to see what Paul and others have been saying on this to inform my stuff. So I would strongly encourage others to go there.
Thanks, Henry. So I'd just like to say we have, again, thank you everyone for participating. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. It's really, really interesting to see your work, and I certainly will be following you in those places. We have two more of these events in the calendar. The next one is, I think it's October 21st, and that one we're going to be talking about kind of monitoring and evaluation, because I think, the unusual circumstances we're in mean that it's hard to sort of know how to measure whether things are going well or not, because because there's so much upheaval. And when are you supposed to compare yourself against 2019, or you're supposed to compare yourself against 2020? So we'll be talking about questions like that. And our head of evidence, I think, is still on the call, Victoria Sutherland, and she will be kind of organizing that workshop. And then the next one, hi Victoria. The next one is in November, and that'll be on business support. So do keep an eye on our website. And do, get in touch if you have questions, if there are particular things that you want to ask us about. We love to hear from people, so please do get in touch. Thanks again, everyone, and have a nice afternoon. It's getting nice out down here.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.